All right, everybody, here's our topics for today. We're going to go through three things. We're going to go through hypertrophy, what it means, how we do it. We're going to go through aerobic and anaerobic respiration, which is how we generate ATP, which is the energy molecule that's so important for us. And then finally, we're going to talk about muscle fibers. There are two different types, and they burn energy at different rates depending on what they are. So this is going to be Crash Course A&P 1, Week 10, Part 2. Here we go. So first off, hypertrophy. So hyper means greater or more than, and troph, interestingly, means to feed. Okay, so when we're talking about hypertrophy, it's basically like we're feeding something a lot. That thing is going to be our muscles. Okay, there's two types of hypertrophy. One is going to be called sarcolemic. Sarcolemic, if you remember, this is basically the membrane of the muscle cells themselves. And this type of hypertrophy happens immediately during and right after exercise. However, it is not long lasting. It does not last long. Okay? So when we think about exercising, if you were to go to the gym right now and do 30 bicep curls with a pretty good sized weight, what you would notice if you walked over to the mirror and you were, wearing a cutoff as you do, you would notice that your biceps appear bigger. And you may think to yourself, wow, I have achieved strength in my bicep. For a time, and kind of. The reason your muscles get big during this type of hypertrophy is only because there's more fluid rushing to the area, like blood and like interstitial fluid that has a lot of electrolytes for your muscles to contract. So this is simply due to fluid accumulation, like blood and other fluids into that muscle area, okay? So you will look swollen, because there's more fluid there. But you sleep on it, you wake up, your biceps are the same size. So the question is, how do we get our muscles to literally get bigger and stay bigger? That is the second type of hypertrophy, which is called myofibril. Okay, and if we remember from last lecture, myofibrils are basically, if we have our muscle cell, long muscle cell, kind of looks like a tube, there will be individual circles inside the tube running the whole length of the muscle fiber, and there will be many of them. These are your myofibrils. These are the ones that contain your sarcomeres, which are your contractile units. So, if we want our muscles to get bigger and stronger, we've basically got to increase our number or size of our myofibrils, thus making our muscle cells bigger, or even potentially stimulating more muscle cell regeneration. Okay, so we need to stimulate these guys to either get bigger or to produce more sarcomeres, which would in turn make it bigger. How do we do that? Well, you may say we have to exercise. I would agree. But there's a certain type of exercise that really helps us build muscle mass and strength and density, and that's going to be primarily eccentric and concentric exercises. Why? Because it induces what's called micro-tearing. So the way we get myofibril hypertrophy is through micro-tears in our muscle cells. And this is what those would look like. So say you've got all your muscle cells nice and smooth, and then you exercise them. So you're shortening them, you're lengthening them under load, and they'll just start to pull apart slightly within the membranes themselves. And so you'll see, if you look under a microscope, just little microscopic tears in your muscle cells. Okay, well that's the first thought with that is that would make your muscles weaker. It would at the time, because now you don't have all these connections between your muscle cells, and so your muscles will be fatigued. They'll be tired when you micro-tear them. However, what's so fascinating is when these micro-tears occur, there's been recent evidence that these little structures that are kind of laying on the muscle cells themselves, the nuclei, they have been found to migrate towards the area of the micro-tears. Now, why the heck would that be important? Well, think about it. If it's a nucleus, it contains DNA that codes for mRNA, that codes for proteins. Proteins like actin, myosin, titin, all these proteins that basically create your sarcomeres, your muscles, right? The contractile units. So when the nuclei migrate there, induced by the tearing, the signals themselves from the tears, they will begin building back proteins so that your muscles will be rebuilt bigger and stronger. Now, that's really fascinating, absolutely amazing. But there's another cell type I can't leave out. And these are called satellite cells, or sometimes called myosatellite cells. If you think of satellites, they orbit around the Earth on the outside and they move. Same thing with the satellite cells. They're on the outside of the muscle fibers and they will crawl towards the site of damage. And as the nuclei are being upregulated to make more protein, they will help organize the process so that all of those muscle fibers are perfectly put so the muscle does get stronger, right? So, great example of how we can literally heal tissue and rebuild it back stronger for the next stimulus. So that is hypertrophy. Step 1 complete. Now, a little more complicated. With muscles, we need a lot of ATP. A ton of ATP because we're firing the circa pump, the sodium-potassium pump frequently in cells. We are also actually making those contractions happen, which requires ATP. So the muscles need a ton of ATP. How do we make it? Through respiration. You may have heard of normal cellular respiration as glucose and oxygen combining to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, and that is true. But there are different pathways by which we get that ATP. So let's walk through two different types. First off, anaerobic means without oxygen, because an means without, aero means air or oxygen, whereas aerobic respiration is with oxygen. Okay? So we're going to follow the pathway of how we make ATP from either of these two processes. Okay? First step is the same for both. We start with our fuel source, which is always going to be glucose in this case. It can also be ketones because they turn into a different molecule that then goes into the citric acid cycle, yada, yada, yada. We're going to ignore that for now. Glucose will go through a process, in both cases, through glycolysis. Glycolysis. Okay, that sounds like glyco, which is a carbohydrate. Lysis meaning to break or burst. We're literally bursting apart glucose to make what's called pyruvate. And in reality, you make two pyruvate molecules. Now, this is where we will diverge. Okay? Oh, but first, I forgot. This process generates a net 2 ATP molecules. So already we've formed some ATP, which is good. Okay? Now, this is where it diverges, like I said. I'm going to follow the anaerobic pathway. When everything gets back, actually, let's go to aerobic first. We're going to go to aerobic first. What will happen? That pyruvate will make its way into the mitochondria. Into the mitochondria, because that's the, everybody says it together, the powerhouse of the cell. It generates a lot of ATP, so I'll take that definition. When it goes into the mitochondria, it'll first go through a step called the citric acid cycle, which will then throw all of its components into what's called the electron transport chain. And that's the end goal of the mitochondria, is to toss these molecules that it makes into the electron transport chain. This process, this chain of electrons flowing through a bunch of proteins, requires oxygen. So this process requires oxygen. So if we have an oxygen deficit, or the output of our muscles is too much for this to stay, we're actually going to flip over to anaerobic respiration. We'll talk about that in a second. So the electron transport chain, once that occurs, this makes a net 30 to 34 ATP, give or take, molecules. So this is an incredibly long-lasting, very efficient type of respiration. So long-lasting and efficient. Okay, so if your body were to choose, it would go to efficient. Your body would go to aerobic respiration anytime. It's making a lot of ATP, slow burning, long lasting, really good. However, sometimes you can't make this happen because you have such a high energy demand that you can't take the time to get all the way through this process. Or this process is happening, but then the energy demand backs up. So now we're flipping into anaerobic. As you can see, the first step is basically the same. So glucose goes into pyruvate, we make a net 2 ATP. Well, in anaerobic respiration, when we don't have enough oxygen to match our output, pyruvate will actually be turned into lactic acid, which the This is kind of debatable, but lactic acid makes a hydrogen ion, and then it can also turn into lactate, and that's the primary, I guess, end product of this whole process. But lactate can also be turned back into pyruvate, go to the electron transport chain. Anyway, we're going to skip that. We make lactate. It's commonly known that lactate can build up in muscles, and it induces fatigue in some way, shapes, or forms, but it's kind of here nor there. We're learning new research that actually lactate might be the end product, and it might go back into pyruvate and then go back into the mitochondria, go to the electron transport chain. I don't worry about that for right now. I want you to know that this is a very fast process. This is very fast, so it's helpful for very fast bursts of energy. So this does not last very long. So it lasts actually only about 30 to 40 seconds because it's without oxygen, because we're not going to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. And it's less efficient. Okay, we're not going to make as many ATP, but it is a fast burning reaction. Okay, think about this as like a very fast burning flame. Okay, it gets really hot really quick and then it's out. This is more of a slow burning flame with aerobic respiration. Okay, so I talked about in class how athletes, especially long endurance athletes, need to have a good balance between both. And so a lot of the times they'll train at what's called their lactate threshold rate, which is where you're running, for example, you're running at a pace where you are kind of flipping back into this anaerobic respiration side, but you almost train your body to pull that lactate, convert it back to pyruvate, combine it with the oxygen as you're breathing very hard, and toss it into the electron transport chain to produce more ATP. But as you exercise and as you exercise, you're going to accumulate more and more and more and more, and then you will eventually fatigue. So you're kind of training yourself to try to reuse that lactate and be able to exercise for longer. Kind of interesting. Okay, so that's aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. Like I said, this one lasts about 30 to 40 seconds. This guy can last hours to days, depending on which muscle group it is, right? There are some muscles that we're using constantly, even though you're not really thinking about it, and they're going to primarily use aerobic respiration because it is so efficient. Okay. Moving on to muscle fibers. This will be a good kind of transition. There's two types, okay, and I'm going to differentiate them. There is a type called slow twitch, which is me because I'm a long distance runner. And then there's going to be fast twitch, the opposite, okay? All people have both slow and fast twitch muscles, but it's more about the ratio of which within your muscle cells themselves. So if we think about like a leg muscle, think about me, I'm a long distance runner. I'm likely going to have more slow twitch fibers because these guys are long lasting and they like to stay aerobic, okay? So they like to stay aerobic, very efficient, whereas fast twitch, I'm not going to have as many fast twitch muscles because these are more short bursts and they last, or they are primarily, usually anaerobic, okay? Because these are very quick bursts. So most of the time, fast twitch muscles will want to flip right to anaerobic respiration, make fast burning fuel, and then fatigue quickly. Whereas slow twitch muscles, they like to do oxidative phosphorylation, which is aerobic respiration. So you may hear the term slow oxidative for slow twitch, and you may hear either fast oxidative or glycolytic for fast twitch. Now, what do those terms mean? Oxidative means with oxygen. Okay, the slow burning oxygen cycle is basically the aerobic respiration. So that's going to be slow twitch all day. Fast twitch, sometimes it can do aerobic respiration, but it's going to be very fast, and it's going to flip to anaerobic relatively quickly. Okay, and anaerobic is glycolytic because we're doing glycolysis. So this process will be happening primarily in fast twitch muscles. Okay, and like I said, all people have both types, but they're in different ratios. So for example, let's say in my, thigh muscles, I have primarily slow twitch muscles, okay, because I'm doing long endurance athletics. However, if I talk to Usain Bolt, famous sprinter, he's going to have more fast twitch muscles in his legs, okay? Those ratios are determined by two things: genetics and your training. Okay, so you can have parents who are sprinters, you'll likely have more fast twitch muscles. If your parents were long distance athletes, you'll probably have more slow twitch muscles. But then you can also alter them based upon your training. So say I train, even though by genetics, I'm a slow twitch muscle guy. Say I start training fast bursts, lots of sprints, lots of heavy lifting, I could start generating some more fast twitch muscles, but I will never have as many as, Jamaican sprinter Usain Bolt, because he's just born that way, right? So it's all about the ratios. Now, when we're talking about these two then, let's write down just a few exercises that we can do. So slow twitch will be more long endurance exercises, whereas fast twitch will be more sprints and heavy lifts, because you need that fast burst of energy. Okay, now, I want you to think with me. If you've eaten chicken before, you have eaten white meat or you've eaten dark meat, okay? When we think about the white meat, it's primarily in the chicken breasts, and the dark meat is primarily in the chicken thighs. If I were to tell you that one of those is a slow twitch muscle and one of those is a fast twitch muscle, which would you say? We'll see if you're right. Slow twitch is going to be dark meat in chickens. Fast twitch is going to be white meat. Why? Chickens use their breast muscles to fly. They fly very quickly, and then they ground. They land. Chickens can't fly very long, so their breasts are fast-burning, fatigue-fast white meat. Whereas their thighs, okay, they're standing up for a long time during the day, they're going to be dark meat. They're long-lasting, slow twitch. Why? Due to what's called their myoglobin. In dark meat, there is high amounts of myoglobin, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. Whereas white meat has low amounts of myoglobin. You may have heard of something that ends in globin before that carries oxygen, and that would be hemoglobin. So in your red blood cells, you will have proteins on your red blood cells called hemoglobin that like to grab oxygen. When they grab oxygen, they turn red. So think about it. Myoglobin is almost like the hemoglobin for muscles. It holds a lot of oxygen. So myoglobin holds oxygen, basically for storage. Okay, so that the body or the muscles can use that oxygen quickly. Okay? So why would slow twitch fibers need more myoglobin than fast twitch? Well, because slow twitch uses aerobic, which is with oxygen. Anaerobic, they don't need as much oxygen. So they don't need myoglobin, therefore it'll be lower, okay? Now, if I were to ask you this, which of these two would have more mitochondria? Well, turns out the slow twitch has more mitochondria, whereas the fast twitch have less mitochondria. Can we think of why? What happens in the mitochondria? The electron transport chain that requires oxygen. So the slow twitch, since it's using a lot of oxygen, has a lot more mitochondria for this process of aerobic respiration, whereas this process doesn't need any oxygen, and also it doesn't use mitochondria. So slow twitch, anaerobic, you don't need mitochondria, interestingly enough. So in slow twitch, we'll have a lot. Fast twitch will have low amounts of mitochondria. So that is a crash course of 3 big topics: hypertrophy, anaerobic versus aerobic, and then finally muscle fibers. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Drop any questions in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time.